listen to full-length, commercial-free episodes of the Divorcing Religion podcast on Patreon. Please sign up at patreon.com/Janice Selby or click the link in the show notes. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. Today, I'm really pleased to have Dr. Caleb Lack joining us as our guest. We met not too long ago when Dr. Lack was a speaker at the conference on religious trauma. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Central Oklahoma, a licensed clinical psychologist, the award-winning educator and best-selling author of 6 books on topics from critical thinking and pseudoscience to racism and sexism in early psychology to various kinds of psychopathology. Dr. Lack specializes in the treatment of children and adults with anxiety disorders and obsessive compulsive and related disorders. He's also the former director of the Secular Therapist Project, which aims to bring together non-religious persons seeking mental health and treatment with secular evidence-based providers. Oh, we love Secular Therapist Project. That's such a wonderful project. I'll just invite you to unmute yourself and we can get down to it. Hi, Caleb. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Janice. I appreciate it.
And I understand you're just recovering from COVID, so extra thank you because I know how tiring that can be. And if you have to cough or anything like that, don't worry about it as we go on. We'll just make do. I'd love to hear some
stash of cough drops here. So if you hear crinkles, it's me doing that.
Okay.
Various.
I'd be interested to know about your own background as far as religion goes and religious trauma goes.
Sure. So, I grew up in a very small rural town here in southwestern Oklahoma, about 800 people, right? So,
wow, that's small.
Pretty small, pretty small. Our school was actually a consolidated school district with another even smaller school, so
wow.
Very, very tiny. And like in a lot of rural areas, the churches, and there was a lot of them, especially for that number of people, the churches are a big part of the community and, a big aspect in terms of socializing and things like that. So I grew up being taken to the Southern Baptist Church, the First Baptist Church there in Mountain View, Oklahoma. And I really, from very kind of early on, was a voracious reader. So I started reading very, very early, like 3.5, 4 years old. Just running through all sorts of stuff and very, very interested early on in different kinds of sciences and, just lots and lots of reading. And that led to lots of awkwardness, it turns out, in my Sunday school classes and things like that, where, I remember very early, and this is probably, I don't know, I'm 5, maybe 6, asking questions of my Sunday school teacher about the Noah's Ark story, which was presented as this kind of, like this is a 100% actual true event that happened, and we're going to learn about it. And then me being like, wait, what? How? Okay, but if they're in the Middle East, how did they get like wallabies and stuff all the way there? What about the Antarctica, stuff? What's going on? And being told repeatedly, basically, to please stop asking questions.
It's a miracle. It's a miracle. God's ways are higher than our ways, Caleb. You'll never understand. Just let it go.
We can't answer your questions, so please don't ask them. So lots of that. And then, lots of very early on in terms of me hearing one thing, like the earth is 6,000 years old, right? Like sort of being presented as factual and, from the preachers and things like that. And then on the other hand, me reading all about dinosaurs that were extinct 65 million years ago, right? And like, here's how the Earth was formed, and then starting to be like, nope, stop it. In the church, not outside the church. My family is very, very supportive of questions, and took me to the library every time I wanted to go, and did whatever they could to kind of encourage.
Good job, Mom and Dad.
Yeah, they're fantastic, but very quickly learned that like, the church is not where you ask questions. This church, anyway. And if you did, then they better be ones that we already know the answers to, as opposed to any other kind. So I never really felt, even though I went, I'm going every week, and sometimes twice a week. Never really felt that, like, oh, I feel this deep connection, right? Or this deep religious sort of feelings. And then the older and older I got, just in terms of reading more and learning more about, for example, comparative mythology and comparative religion, and reading more and more about that, and just going, so these stories aren't unique, right? Like, these have predecessor stories, or they have very similar themes that you see in many other, religious backgrounds. And okay, well, but why? Like, but why is this one the one true only thing? And
okay, I got to just break in and say that was totally shocking for me when I finally started to read outside of Christianity and see that there were other myths that had, similar themes and stories. And that was really uncomfortable for me to find that out, because it never crossed my mind when I was a devout Christian that could be the case.
Yeah, and I think for most people it doesn't, right? Because they're not exposed to this being a possibility. This thing that is, right? We have religions that predate Christianity by thousands of years. We have stories that predate that by thousands of years, and turns out they were good at stealing things, right? Like, just like we all are. And it's like, I'm going to take that idea, I'm going to take this idea. And the more you learn about kind of the history, I think, of religion generally, and the history of Christianity specifically, for me, it was just kind of like this gradual stepping out and stepping away, and then seeing more and more of kind of, hypocritical behaviors, and, a lack of respect for people who didn't believe the way that you did, right? Or people who were different than you. And those didn't really fit with who I was, right? So I continued to go because I'm at my parents' home and they're going, and I continue to be, I say go, taken. I continue to be taken, to church, and all through high school, and but really kind of stopped after that. I mean, I did, a little bit going here and there with friends to various kinds of churches in college and things like that.
Did you go to Christian college or secular college?
No, I went to Oklahoma State. It's a secular university, but I'm not sure up in Canada, but certainly here, there's always lots and lots of the religious hangers-on, like institutions around any of the big universities, right? So there's the Baptist College Mission, and there's the Methodist Wesley Foundation, and then there's all these different religious groups that are kind of hanging on the edge of campus, getting everybody who comes there, trying to come in. Here's free pizza on Wednesdays, come on in.
Knowing that that's a real vulnerable time when people are in a point of transition, such as being away from home for the first time in a college or university town, and churches and cults just race in there at breakneck speed to try and convert people.
Yeah, and kind of fill that void for a lot of folks when they move away, right? I don't have my social support network right here. I've had for the last 18 years, 19 years. Hey, we can fill that, right? Like, come on down. And we have free pizza.
Yeah. No beer, but we have pizza.
We got plenty of pizza. So yeah, just kind of, sort of gradually for me stepping away and stepping out of that. I can't really say that I had much in terms of like religious trauma or anything like that. Probably the closest would just be me as a very cognitively sophisticated, for my age, 6-year-old being scared out of my mind by the idea of the hellfire damnation sort of preaching and the revelations kind of coming down and taking everyone and leaving the sinners behind and things like that. And
so how did you cope with that then?
Well, for me at that age, like I didn't basically, right? I'm like 6 and I'm sitting there at night, like staring wide awake into the top bunk,
Because adults are telling you this is true.
Yeah, I mean, they and not just telling me, but shouting it at me, right? Like every week or twice a week, you're sitting in the pews. It's like, hey, we're gonna make sure you feel terrible about this. And it's like, well, but okay, well, maybe. What if it was me? What if it was my friends or my family? Maybe they're not saved. Maybe they're not going to go. I think that was one of those first parts that sort of, certainly put a sour taste in my mouth for this idea of, eternal punishment for something that you didn't do eternally. It seems like very odd, even to me as like, again, a 6-7-year-old kid. It's like, that seems like a little bit of a heavy punishment, So, but in terms of like religious trauma, I didn't really have much. I mean, I remember, feeling very odd, right? Because everyone around me is seemingly, kind of buying full forth into this. Right?
Yes, and emotionally enraptured. Like it's meeting so many emotional and psychological needs. And you're kind of on the outside going, this doesn't compute.
Yeah, very much like, are you feeling something? I don't know what's going on, right? Like I'm just feeling confused for the most part. Very unhappy because now I can't ask questions, and I've been told to stop asking questions, and I just want to know, right? Like, and I think I've always had that sort of idea of like, well, if someone asks you a question and you can't give a good answer, that's probably because you don't have one. So you can't answer my question, I'm pretty sure you don't know what you're talking about, right? Or you don't have a solid, I wouldn't know this term back then, but epistological sort of foundation for that belief.
So how were you be able to release your fear of hell then? Did that come about when you were a teen or a young adult?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say probably as a teen, I stopped, pretty, I wouldn't say rapidly, but kind of, from that kind of preteen, 12-ish, 13 up to about 16, 17, I had already kind of been stepping further and further away from the idea of this kind of, God of the Old Testament, God of the New Testament, towards more of kind of like a universalist idea, which again, I didn't know the words for this at the time, but more this kind of universalist idea. And you're like, well, that doesn't make sense. And, seeing it more as kind of like a control thing, right? So like we're trying to control what people do and don't do, and some people need threats to control them, I guess.
Right. Were there conversations going on at home as your mom and dad recognized you pulling away from the religious teachings?
No, I'm not necessarily. I mean, I was doing lots of reading at that point, different religions, which, was not discouraged in any way or anything like that. And just kind of learning more and more. But, again, this is early 90s, right? I'm in a small rural area. I have no access to even the idea that you can be non-theistic. Like I really don't even know that's an option, honestly, right? So even the idea of kind of having, or the thought of having that as an option at that age in that time it's like, no, that's not a thing. Like everybody believes. It's just you believe things that are different maybe from somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And so even that kind of, that the term atheist or something was like not even in my vocabulary really. Because there certainly weren't books about that sort of thing in my little small town library. Most of the books and information I would get would be like when my mom was going to college. She went back to college when I was about 9.
Nice.
So I would go with her and, go hang out in the library up there at the university. And, she could check books out and I could get them there. And,
very cool.
So things like that, but not a lot of, conversations really about that because it's more me just saying like, I keep going because I'm, being made to go. And that's what everyone does. Like everyone's going in my friend group to church. So
was that an issue at all then as your friends were believing these things for the most part? Did you have any other friends that you could talk with about, I don't know, how real do you think that is? Like, do you think that really happened or not really?
Not really. Kind of in retrospect, I think there were probably a couple people that were, having those same sort of thoughts as me. But again, like this isn't something that anyone talks about at that time period, right? Especially in rural Oklahoma. So, it's like, okay, well, we just hang out and do the typical things that, teenagers do. Drag Main Street, right? And waste untold gallons of gasoline going back in our trucks and cars and things like that. But not really a whole lot of that. Just because it was, it's one of those things where it's so pervasive, right? Like that belief is so pervasive that you can't step outside of it really until, in my case, when I went to college and was able to start getting a little bit broader view of the world. And seeing like, that person's a Jew. What? I've never met a Jewish person before I went to college, right? Or eaten Asian food, right? Or really met anyone outside of my kind of small rural community. So, for me, that moving into college is where I could really start having like, maybe I can talk about some of these things. Maybe I can look and talk to other people. But even then, late 90s, it's not like things like the Secular Student Alliance were really around, right? There was no group for non-believers or skeptics or anything like that on pretty much any campus, especially not in Oklahoma at that time.
Right. And this is certainly pre-podcast era.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the internet was, in terms of accessible to people, very nascent still, right?
Yeah.
My first papers I'm writing, I'm still going and doing card catalog. Flipping through stuff in the library.
I remember. Yeah.
And then they introduced the electrical ones and the search engine, and it was like, what? This is incredible, right? I don't have to go dig through the card catalog now. So yeah, certainly, none of that was much of a thing. And that really wasn't until I was in grad school that some of that sort of stuff, started taking off in the early 2000s. And even then, very small amounts of that kind of thing. So.
And did you know at this time that you wanted to become a psychologist?
I did. So I kind of figured that out in spring of 1998. So I had gone to university as a biochemistry major, actually. I was very interested in genetics and biochem, and was on a lovely scholarship and was in senior level 4,000 level classes, like biochem classes, and doing research my first semester. And about 2/3 of the way through that first semester, I was like, I don't really like this. Like, this is kind of boring. Like, I'm up here at night at, 1 a.m. measuring yeast cell growth, right? Like, this is not my idea of exciting research. But I didn't know what else I wanted to do until I took a general psychology class in spring of 1998 with Dr. Bill Scott, who's a longtime professor at Oklahoma State. I didn't know psychology, much like the term atheist, right? Like, psychology wasn't part of my vocabulary.
Right.
I didn't know anyone who worked in mental health. I didn't really know mental health was a thing at all. And then I took this class and I was like, hey, that's kind of cool. Like,
pretty interesting.
The science part, which I really like. It's got helping people aspect, which I really like. You can do research, you can teach, you can practice, you can do all these things. Like, this seems pretty cool. And so I switched my major over for my sophomore year to psychology and kind of never looked back.
Wow.
And here we are 24 years later. Still psychologizing. So
amazing. And you're also a writer. And so the things that you've written, are they all psychology related as well, the books that you've written?
Yeah. For the ones that are already published, yes. So most of them are either about specific kinds of psychopathology, anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, things like that. Some history. I was a history minor, ancient classical studies and history minor. I've always loved history and still do. And so one of them is kind of a history of psychology book about early research and how it was in large part highly sexist, highly racist. But how it had sort of still that veneer of science on it, right? Because, it was looking sciencey, and using the words, but not being unbiased like we would hope.
Right. So what pulled you into the anxiety aspect of things as kind of your major treatment focus?
Yeah, so I got interested first in PTSD and post-traumatic stress disorder in undergrad. And was like, this is a pretty fascinating thing, like there's, this traumatic event, and then the vast majority of people will be fine afterwards, but there's a subset of people that are really going to struggle.
Right.
And here in Oklahoma, I don't know if you know this, Janice, or not, but we have more tornadoes per square mile than anywhere else on Earth.
Oh my gosh, I did not know that.
Anywhere else on Earth.
Talk about anxiety inducing.
Yeah. And so I had grown up with natural disasters, right? Like, it's kind of part of growing up in Oklahoma is being around natural disasters. And so when I moved to the university, I started meeting lots of people who didn't grow up in Oklahoma, right? And then I started seeing them freaking the hell out during tornado season.
Right.
They're like, oh my God, we're all going to die, And then us native Okies were like, let's go out in the yard and look, right? And let's see if we can see it. Let's get up high and see if we can see it. It's over that way. And these people are like, we're all going to die. Wow. And that sort of got me interested in that idea of, how do you adapt to and either have or not have these traumatic responses to natural disasters. And so that's actually what my research, primarily my clinical research was in grad school, was about children's responses to natural disasters. And
wow.
How kids, I looked at like 8 to 12-year-olds who had and hadn't experienced tornadoes. How did they do? Like, how are they doing as a long-term follow-up to experiencing and going through a tornado? And then also not having personally experienced it, but living in this disaster-prone area. what does that do to somebody, right? Like, how does that cause changes, kind of temporally, in how you're having these kind of post-traumatic stress symptoms, even if you didn't have the trauma necessarily. So that's what I did for my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation, and which gives you a good grounding in anxiety generally, right?
Yes.
And trauma. And then when I went to the University of Florida for my predoctoral internship, I started doing a lot of work with people who have obsessive compulsive disorder, and just found it fascinating. Really loved working with these folks, being able to help them very quickly with our exposure and response prevention kinds of treatments. And then just from there, it's like, all right, now I'm basically become an expert in anxiety, right? And how does anxiety work in all these different ways? And for me, anxiety is fascinating because it's so adaptive, right? Like, it's so useful. Like, none of us would be alive if we never got anxious.
Right.
But what happens when it becomes out of control? Right? Like, what are the aspects that spin it out of control? And then how can we rein
good
it?
Servant, poor master.
Yes. Yes, very much so. Yeah. And so that just became kind of my main area of interest. And there's lots of really interesting questions you can ask and cool clinical work you can do. And it turns out it's an area that, a lot of people have these kinds of problems. And not a lot of treatment providers do the effective treatments for them. Our research shows maybe 25% of treatment providers actually provide the best standard treatments for anxiety-based problems, which means 75% don't, right? So being able to help other people learn those methods, has become kind of a big push in terms of what I do is training and outreach and things like that.
Oh, when you were talking about anxiety, tornadoes, children, trauma, it really, the ultimate kind of traumatizing idea, when I'm thinking in terms of religion, is that at the end, people are going to go to hell and burn forever in eternal torment, and you are going to be separated from your parents and from everyone you love and from God, and there will be no relief. That is pretty much the king of horrible things that we think could ever happen. So I
pretty
think
much worst
that,
outcome, yeah.
Yeah, and that if you are born into a Christian family and this is taught to you week in, week out, as if it's, I got air quotes, the gospel truth here, and you have you're not equipped psychologically or emotionally to deal with that when that is first fed to you as a child. You don't have the ability to critically discern, well, is this actually reality, or is this just someone else's idea of what they think could happen? We don't have that ability when we're a child. All we know is, oh my God, this is my parent or my authority figure telling me this terrifying truth. I'm going to take it in and put all sorts of psychological booby traps around it so I don't poke at it or pull at it or tug on it or anything. I'm just going to let it sit there. And then, we come to later in life and we've hopefully been able to deconstruct and deconvert from all the views and the toxic teachings. But that fear of hell can be so tenacious for people. And I mean, I've had doctors say to me, they're obviously intelligent people. They know logically there is not a hell as, Christian people describe it, but it's so hard for them to release that anxiety and that fear. It's a really big deal for people recovering from religious trauma syndrome.
Well, and that's one of the things that's most interesting about fear, right? Is that often what we do to protect ourselves from it is actually the opposite of what we need to do to get over it, right? So if I'm having thoughts, like an intrusive thought about hell, right? And I recognize, logical part of myself is going, okay, that doesn't exist. But my emotional part's still like, oh, shit, maybe. What if it does?
Right.
Oh, that would be, oh no. Most of us want naturally, when something's scary or frightening or upsetting, what do we want to do? We want to get away from it. Right? Like, I want to get out of here. And then that makes my anxiety come down. That makes my fear go away. That helps in the short term. But it turns out what it does in the long term is it just reinforces the idea that this is dangerous. Right?
Wow.
Right? This thought is dangerous. This idea is dangerous. This memory I have is dangerous. And so the next time it comes up, or the next time I see a billboard about going to hell,
which are all over the southern United States, I have to say.
You know, you've been down here, you know. It's just like, is that the best use of your money, really? Okay. But the next time I do something like that or see that emotional part pops up again, right? It pops up very strong. And then I try and get rid of it again. And so you develop this negative cycle, right, of strong emotion and avoidance and escape, which then reinforces that this is dangerous.
Wow.
But in order to get better, we have to do the opposite, right? We have to see, is it actually dangerous?
Wow.
Is that memory dangerous, right? Is this idea dangerous? Or will my anxiety go down naturally, even if I don't escape? And that's the entire point of doing something like exposure and response prevention, which is one of our cognitive behavioral therapy means for helping with fear, right? Is I'm going to expose you to this feared stimuli that's not actually dangerous. And then I'm going to prevent your normal anxiety or fear-based response. And we'll see what happens. Do you stay anxious forever and then your heart explodes and you die, which is what people think will happen, right?
Right, yeah.
Or will that actually go down naturally across time? And you start to learn, hey, I didn't need to be afraid of that spider, heights, airplane, snake, hell, right? Whatever it happens to be. And we use the same techniques in PTSD, except we're exposing you primarily to memories, right? To memories as opposed to something external to yourself. Because in religious trauma and other forms of PTSD, what we see is that people are afraid of their memories.
Yes.
Right? They view these as dangerous, as terrifying, as bad. And yeah, they might be bad, but that doesn't mean that we have to be afraid of them. Because they're just that, they're memories, right? And they can't hurt us any more than we let them hurt us.
So in addition to the exposure end of things, are you also having clients do research on things like where did this idea originate? Like, my parents got it from somewhere. Who first came up with this notion of hell being a lake of fire and all this stuff? Do you have them do some research along those lines as well?
So a lot of it depends on the individual. Some folks, they don't care, right? They're like, I'm out, I'm done, I don't want to learn more about this.
Sure.
And that's fine, right? There are other folks who for them it becomes hey, I need to understand this more, right? Like I need to grapple with this a little bit. And either way is fine, right? It just depends on what they want to do. Like when I'm treating people, what I'm looking at is, what are you unable to do right now that you want to do? Right? Like what are you being prevented from doing by your fear, by your anxiety? How's it impairing you functionally? And for some people that might be like, well, I would like to go support my family and be able to go to church with them, right? But I'm having all these terrible intrusive flashbacks. And it's like, okay, well, let's work towards that. For some people it might be, I just don't want to be afraid if someone says the word hell, right? Or if I see a reminder, or I see a Bible, or I see, a preacher or whatever. I don't want to have a fear response. So it really depends on what it is that the person wants to be able to do, right, at the end of this. Because my goal is I want you to be able to live your life being afraid of only things that you need to be afraid of. Right. Yeah. Not that we're getting rid of all fear.
Right.
but that we want you to be able to not worry about or be afraid of things that you don't need to be afraid of. In this case, an imaginary concept that, is not really in the Bible.
Right. And then some folks, not only do they struggle with anxiety around religious things, but the word that we've heard come into play over the last couple of years, really the scrupulosity, the religious OCD, and it seems like that would be just so incredibly restricting. Living with scrupulosity. Can you talk about that at all? I don't know if any clients with scrupulosity, would they come to see you?
Yeah, because of my expertise in OCD.
And we should explain what scrupulosity is.
Sure. So scrupulosity is this idea that I have to think the right things, do the right things, act in the right ways, or otherwise this terrible kind of religious consequence will happen.
Okay.
So, for in OCD, the biggest thing that we see is people who are worried about blasphemy. Right. So they have an intrusive thought, an obsession that either I might have accidentally blasphemed or I might be going to do that. And so then they have to perform a compulsion, right? An act that's designed to reduce that anxiety. And much like with PTSD, when I start avoiding things that make me upset or afraid, when I start doing compulsions, what happens is my anxiety goes down.
Yeah.
Just for a little bit. Right. And then what happens is it makes me think I should have done that in the first place. This is a dangerous thought. This is something that I need to be worried about, which paradoxically actually makes those obsessive thoughts happen more frequently.
Oh, wow.
Because when you try not to think about something, it turns out it doesn't work, right?
Nope.
Janice, don't think about a purple giraffe, right? Whatever you do, don't do it. And then you're like, well, shit. Well, there it is, right? And it's going to be there. Thanks. And it's the same thing with intrusive thoughts, whether you're talking about intrusive memories and PTSD, or whether you're talking about obsessions and OCD. And so people will have this idea of I blasphemed, or I might, right? You'll get very, very anxious. I'll do a compulsion, usually some type of prayer behavior to get rid of that anxiety, but then it just starts cycling around and doing it over and over again.
Wow.
And mostly we see that in people who are still actively religious.
Okay.
So, if, for example, if I'm not religious and I have that intrusive kind of thought, if I blasphemed, then I'm going to be like, well, who gives a fuck, right? It doesn't matter because that's not a real thing, right? So I'm just going about my business. But if I am religious, right, and I have that intrusive thought that, oh, you might have blasphemed, then all of a sudden that's going to make me upset, right?
Right.
And we see a similar sort of mechanism at play with a lot of people in terms of fear of hell, right? Where, I have a thought about that and it makes me upset, but usually people don't then do a compulsion, right? They're not praying or something. They just do avoidance behaviors, right?
Yeah.
Try not to think about this. I'm going to try to avoid driving by a church. I'm going to try to avoid any sort of conversation about religion. So they're less likely to do kind of a compulsive type of behavior and more of an avoidance or an escape behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. I have real concern for folks with mental illness that really, they end up having some psychoses around. And if religion has factored into their life, then some of the psychoses can revolve around religion. And if they're, command hallucinations, it can get pretty terrible and pretty awful. And so it's just, religion is so pervasive and it can be so insidious just because of the society that we live in, where it's normalized for people to believe in an invisible, all-powerful being. It's not normal for adults to believe in Superman or, Santa Claus or those things, but it's certainly considered abnormal by a lot of people if you don't believe in God, or maybe it says that you're not humble enough if you don't believe in that God is up there. Someone's got to be running this whole thing, is of course how people comfort themselves, because it's hard for people to accept the randomness of the universe.
It is. I mean, there's a lot of it that's very, control based, right? So I'm doing this to control these negative emotions, right? So a fear of death, right? A fear of randomness and chaos, a fear of not knowing what happens, to us after we die, which it's the same thing that happens before we're born, right? Nothing.
Right.
But a lot of people don't like that, right? And like that kind of that thought of your own morality for many people is a very highly anxiety causing event. So
mortality?
Mortality, yes.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And, people who, even if they're not religious, say, I think of someone who has tried to do everything right, and they jog 5 miles a day, and they're maybe vegan, and they do all these things, and they're stricken with colon cancer or something that just is hideously unfair given how responsible they have tried to be. Then not only are they coping with the loss of their health, but the dissolution of their worldview, of their feeling of safety, of order, and right is right and wrong is wrong, all these things. And then suddenly it's, oh my God, I did all these things to protect myself or my child or whatever. And then life happened anyway. Tragedy happened anyway. So it's not just people who've grown up in religion who can suffer the dissolution of their worldview. But I mean, this is a show about divorcing religion, but I just want people to be aware and to be compassionate. It's a really big deal when people are coping with physical and mental health concerns, and it's also impacting their worldview. We really need to be compassionate with folks.
Yeah, and recognizing that, even if I have a particular belief and, I want to help someone else be comforted, that belief may not be actually comforting, right? Like, I can't even tell you how many times I've, people that I've worked with who are like, had a terrible thing happen, someone died in their family, and then they're like, if one more person tells me, this was God's plan, or God has a plan, I'm going to punch someone, and so recognizing that, no, not everyone needs to have the same kind of coping or control mechanisms that, you do. It's not something a lot of people are good at.
Yeah. And the idea that magical thinking is very transferable. So we can have magical thinking around there's God watching over us, protecting, all this kind of thing. But then, so we lose someone, and then our desire is to have continued contact with that person. So then we switch that magical thinking over to, this person can communicate with dead people. And then, then our money's going over to that person, and our beliefs are going in that direction as well. We need to be careful and mindful as human beings, because we're susceptible. We want comfort. And when we think we know the answer, we feel comforted and reassured.
It's true. Yeah. I mean, and even in our, one of the things I found in our research on trauma is that any explanation for why something bad happened is better than no explanation.
Yes.
Right. So any kind of attribution you latch on to for why something bad happened is better than not having an explanation. And you're more mentally healthy. You're better off having any explanation, even if it's a negative one, right? Even if this person must have done something bad and that's why they got cancer, right? Or they're being punished for this or that. Even that, you're more healthy than you are if you're constantly searching for why, right?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So how does that factor into working with children then? Children who have anxiety and children who need tremendous reassurance.
So reassurance, it turns out, if you have a child who's prone to anxiety of any kind, reassurance backfires on you. So for children who are not prone to anxiety, if something bad happens, I reassure you, hey, it's going to be okay. Oh, okay, great. Like I'm good to go. But for children who have anxiety, what that does is that reinforces this idea that, hey, maybe this was bad, right? Like maybe this was more scary, uncomfortable, unpleasant. Something negative is happening here, or otherwise, why would you reassure me, right? Like, why would you be comforting me if something bad didn't happen?
What's a parent to do?
It's a tough situation. And again, this isn't for all kids, right? Most kids, you reassure them and they go on their way and they're fine.
Yeah.
But if you've got a kid who's, let's say, prone to social anxiety or prone to obsessive compulsive disorder, thanks to, a biological loading, what you do is you actually start to reinforce that idea, right? Or let's say your kid is reluctant to speak up in front of other people. And so you start speaking for them, right? And you start, taking care of that to ease their anxiety. What does that teach them? It teaches them that, I should be anxious, obviously, because mom or dad's taking care of it for me. And I'm anxious and I didn't have to overcome it. So I should have been nervous and upset here, right? Or, if a lot of kids that I see with OCD, the parents start helping them unknowingly, helping them reinforce their obsessions by giving them reassurance, by providing them, no, it's okay, becoming part of the rituals. And that kind of accommodation when you're anxious, it just makes things worse in the long run. I explained this to a mom not too long ago. She and her daughter who was here, who was very highly socially anxious. And I explained to them how this accommodation works, right? And when you as the parent are doing all these things for your child, what it does is it actually makes them more anxious in the long run because they don't learn to cope with it, right? They don't learn to handle these things on their own. And this mom's sitting there like, oh. And then she just goes, shit.
Yeah.
I did this. And I was like, I'm not saying you did this. I'm saying you got caught up in this cycle. She's like, oh, no, it's okay. I did. I totally did everything you're talking about. And that's why she's so anxious. And I was like, well, it's part of it. It's part of it.
Right. But then she would recognize where she can modify her behavior then and potentially be helping her daughter.
Which is a big part, it turns out, of working with people who are anxious, is working with their family. And even as an adult, working with their family to help people stop accommodating, stop reassuring, so you develop your own ability to cope with things that are scary and frightful and anxiety producing, instead of having to rely on other people to take care of that scary thing for you.
Right. So then what would you say for folks who are watching or listening to our episode, if they are struggling, say, with fear of health? Besides booking an appointment with you, which would be wonderful, what other steps can they start taking to find some relief, to make changes in their neural network so that they're not so gripped by this fear anymore?
So there's several things you can do, and it really it depends kind of on your level of fear and your level of motivation, right? Okay. So if you are highly afraid, but very, very motivated, first thing and best thing you can do is learn about how fear works, right? Kind of like we talked about earlier. I did a hour-long talk on that at the conference on religious trauma, right?
Yes.
Exactly how this works and maintains.
Yes.
And then you can start working on your own plan, right? Like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to expose myself to these things in small steps, prevent my anxiety response, let it go down naturally, do the next step. And some people can do that on their own. A lot of people are going to need help. In which case you want to find particularly a cognitive behavioral therapist who knows how to do exposure and response prevention. And that can be, let's say, going through, the Secular Therapy Project, like seculartherapy.org. That can be through the International Obsessive Compulsive Disorder Foundation's website. That could be through the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, Find a Therapist. But not just going to any therapist.
Right.
Because it turns out most therapists who don't know how to do exposure and response prevention will actually do the same things that like your family does. It just makes it worse, right? Where they'll reassure you and they'll be like, oh, well, then you just shouldn't go to these things or do these things.
Right.
Which help in the short term, right? But are way worse in the long run.
Yeah.
You can also, particularly for people who have like more of a religious trauma background, there are some wonderful kind of self-guided treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder. And I can send you a list, Janice. You can put up in like show notes if you'd like.
Yes, wonderful.
So there are some nice, things that can help guide you by yourself. But for a lot of folks who have really, clinical level fear and anxiety, they need somebody to walk through it with them. And so finding a therapist that does good evidence-based work in anxiety and fear becomes pretty important for most of those folks.
This has just been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today. I will be in contact with you to get some of those links to put in our show notes for folks who are interested in this and want to learn more. And so thanks everyone for tuning in to this episode of the Divorcing Religion podcast. And I want you to subscribe to the Conference on Religious Trauma YouTube channel so that you never miss an episode of the Divorcing Religion podcast. And also so that you'll be able to watch Dr. Lack's full session on overcoming fear of hell when it comes time that we put that on the YouTube channel as well. Thanks everyone. Take care.